The next 2 weeks passed rapidly. Fortunately, it only took a bit more than a day for confirmation that there had been no accidental transcendent breach on Vesta, either at the habitat or at the Sarissa wormhole installation. Both were open with normal communications restored, which allowed for the wormhole return of the evacuated personnel. At Sarissa, the suspect components which Pro Bono had removed were slagged and replacements installed. Sarissa became fully operational soon after, and joined Phobos, which was busy sending scouting probes to the area of the destroyed Ark. Only 3 days after the Ark's destruction, and as much as I dreaded missing anything of consequence, I had myself poked back to High Castle in Earth orbit. There I would be spending a day in Naomi's medical creche, having a new thumb grafted on. Naomi simply stated that the replacement parts came from reserves. Despite my curiosity, reserves sounded just horrifying enough that I did not dare inquire. Still, I couldn't help but imagine a lab full of vats containing fully grown and partially harvested clones of my current shell. Ugh. When I arrived and before I was stuck into the creche, I did get to visit briefly with Ux and Rami. Our daughter had already left High Castle, having fled back to Antarctica as her mother recovered enough and became even more cantankerous to be around than normal. I would have to send Kayla a thank you for standing in for me here while I'd remained on Mars. Ux and Rami had met me at the wormhole arrival and departure sphere. Rami was carrying a small satchel, and I inferred that they were soon to depart. When I pulled myself over to where Ux was waiting, she first grabbed my head, giving me a quick congratulatory kiss and greeting. She next slugged me hard in the shoulder for not priming acid rain much earlier in the process. Apparently, only an idiot would have waited until the absolute last seconds as I had. "Serves you right for losing your damn thumb," she'd exclaimed after a second, thankfully weaker punch. "I'm glad your injury was not serious," she whispered as she hugged me to her a second time, this time lingering much longer. I felt her relief. "Lesson learned," I replied simply. Rami just shook his head, watching our byplay, a slight smile and a curious, sympathetic look on his face after I'd received my message. "I see you are all packed to go. Are you recovered enough to be getting back to work?" I asked her once we'd released each other. She exchanged a look with Rami. This time, her partner did not look happy at all. "She has chosen to undergo a brain transplant down on Earth before returning to Pallas," he explained with an almost haunted look. "It's not as bad as it sounds," Ux said quickly, almost defensively, upon seeing my reaction. "There is an experimental clone being grown down in Old Ankara, which is based on the same template as my current shell," she explained. "The clone still has half a decade before reaching full maturity, but its brain is far enough along and so heavily augmented that it will be adequate." Seeing my doubtful look remain, she continued, "The clone brain is compatible with my shell. All we need to do is swap brains. The clone gets my damaged one, which can be repaired slowly at the cellular level using nanobots. I get the new one in its advanced augments. The augmentation will compensate for the brain's lack of maturity, and it will allow even more added capacity in the future. If I swap, I can be back on Pallas and productive in less than a week." I kept my true reaction internal. "Naomi, explain please," I subvocalized. "The procedure is relatively safe," Naomi answered via implant. "It is the most expeditious method for Ux to return to a mentally boosted state. The downside is that she will be mostly paralyzed for 5 weeks until the shell's nerve pathways can be properly regrown. The added augments would be busy maintaining more important body functions like breathing and blood circulation than simple physical movement. The low gravity on Pallas will actually be of benefit in this regard." Relatively safe? The chances of transplantation failure are less than 15%. If failure does occur, her mind data will have to be digitally stored until it can be resleeved into a compatible new shell. Since such a shell is currently unavailable, the storage period may exceed a decade while one is accelerated to maturity. She is willing to risk a transplant failure and be stored away out of action for over a decade? I asked, still subvocally. Ux was watching me curiously, likely having deduced that I was discussing her situation with Naomi. Her mind data would be stored in an active state, in a new research wing created for her in the SRP. Since her mental faculties would be simulated, there would be a possible temporary degradation in her intuition. But still, in that environment, she should be able to assist in the faster-than-light research ongoing in reality. I'd never considered that option. I'd known it was possible as we'd had the Amor Fati children living only in virtual until they reached maturity. Oaks had obviously considered the risks and still chosen to proceed. Who was I to deny her? "I wish you a speedy recovery, honey," I said simply, capitulating early and amusingly, surprising the hell out of her in the process. Even Rami blinked and looked perplexed at my easy acceptance of her risky, unorthodox choice. "You will probably still be down on Earth after I'm done getting my hand repaired?" "Yes, I will be in surgery and recovery for a few days, and then we will poke ourselves directly back to Palace," she replied before adding hesitantly, "We could wait for you here until you are done." I could tell she was not enthusiastic about staying up here to watch me cook in a vat for almost a day. "No, I'll be fine. Omu will be along any minute now and will play nurse. We'll catch up again soon when you are re-brained and back in your right mind. Or wrong mind, as will be the case." The comment earned me groans from both of them. A day later, and now in the possession of a full complement of opposable digits, I returned to Mars. This time, I arrived down on the surface inside the PMC's domed ceremonial palace on top of Olympus Mons. The popular Martian Congress officially maintained the gaudy palace, mainly as a symbol for the planet and for the organization. But from how it was equipped and the way the attendees were imbibing, I suspected it was used mostly as a private retreat for the party officials. Why was I arriving here? Well, I was about to be knighted. Her Royal Highness, Princess Deja Neothoris, did the honors in front of a throng of over a few dozen higher-ranking Congress members. Despite the still-rising controversy over my recent actions, Princess Deja was choosing to enter the political fray and take sides by honoring me publicly. I was not quite sure if it would help, but I was also sure it couldn't hurt, so I played along. "Rise, Sir John, honorary Knight Commander of the Red Guard," she said. Her consort, my grandson Ben, was standing behind her trying to conceal his grin. He knew what I really thought of this sort of pomp. The audible applause of the attending humans was joined by the virtual masses who were watching remotely. According to the watch numbers, the event had an audience of 500,000, about 499,000 more than I'd expected. Oh well, at least the title was honorary. That meant I could get away with shirking any future PMC duties required of an official Knight Commander. Those were mainly public appearances and periodic classroom lectures. I rose and let my admirers pull me to the open bar so the enjoyable part of the function could begin. 4 days later, I was back on Phobos, waiting near the entry to the airlock leading to the big wormhole mechanism crater. Hannah Crather was with me. She was wearing her combat pressure suit with the helmet visor up. I was holding back a smile at her cross expression. "Are you sure you still don't want to come?" Hannah asked for the third time. "You can wear one of the spare suits from storage?" "Yes, I'm sure I want to remain on this side of the wormhole," I replied. "Besides, Riho will be occupying my seat on Higgins. You could ride in the fourth seat pod. Omu could stay outside, strapped to the hull." I just shook my head and pointed for her to go. Hannah sighed and let the airlock door close in between us. I watched as she pulled herself through the airlock and down the short tunnel connecting it to Higgins. The assault boat's hatch shut behind her, sealing her inside with Alec, Riho, and Omu, who had already boarded. This would be the first time Higgins was used on an actual mission, but it had had many local test flights, so the craft was mostly proven. The airlock tube retracted, and I turned to begin my journey back to the inhabited side of Phobos. I was the only human remaining near the wormhole generator, so I had the tube shuttle all to myself for the return trip through the tunnel connecting the wormhole facility to the command and control area on the opposite side of the moonlet. As I rode the shuttle, I tried to dismiss the worry I felt for my son and friends. This would be the first human deployment through the wormhole to the Ark. Their destination was Farlobe, our new name for the former nickel-iron spheroid aft end of the enemy Ark. After the Ark had been blasted to pieces, both Near Lobe and Far Lobe had survived mostly intact. Despite the mission being the first for humans, we'd spent much of the last week sending probes, mobile units, and space-capable automated warfighters to both Near Lobe and Far Lobe. They had scoured both objects, hunting for any still active enemy units. Nothing active had been detected on Farlobe, but early on the probes had detected a strong source of emissions from a deeply dug-in facility on Near Lobe. That anything survived the antimatter explosion was not completely unexpected, as each lobe provided over 700 meters of nickel-iron shielding from the gamma flux. Whatever had survived on Near Lobe had also been buried deep under the former forward-facing interstellar range particle cannon. That facility had since ceased all emissions because we had targeted it with multiple missile salvos soon after detection. No attempt had been made to stop our incoming missiles, and each had scored deeply into Near Lobe. Precise targeting and repetition accomplishing what the earlier 800 times larger acid rain-generated explosion had failed to do. Now there was only silence from the assemblage. Nothing from both lobes, but also no emanations from surrounding space, including ahead of the former arc, where the debris shielding herding units dwelled, and trailing it where the mines and sensors had been placed. All that had been active had been intercepted, destroyed, or co-opted into becoming ours by employing our advanced override algorithms. 3 hours later, I was still monitoring the ongoing Higgins deployment from the safety of the control room. It reminded me of watching deep-sea divers performing a televised dive inside the sunken remains of a ship. Alec, Hannah, and Riho, in their combat pressure suits, followed a squad of combat mobile units which had arrived earlier by carrier boat. The environment inside the Farlobe tunnels we were mapping was dark, near weightless, and hard vacuum. As a result, maintaining orientation was difficult. Also, the Farlobe tunnels looked to have never been occupied by living beings. First of all, there were no airlocks. Secondly, the maze of tunnels only contained automated factories and now almost empty resource storage bays. There were also multiple processor clusters and data storage banks, all looking eerily similar to ours. None were active, and most even looked damaged, almost as if they had overloaded. Still, the team kept well away from the enemy data centers, seeking to avoid anything left behind by our transcendent destroyer. At the 4-hour mark, the team began returning to the surface. As they closed in on their entry point, they did one final task, which was forming a secure area of tunnels just deep enough into the lobe for protection from cosmic radiation or interstellar debris impact. Why? Well, we planned to occupy Farlobe. Plans were drawn up to build a base and laboratory there. Jonathan and Beatrice had stepped up and volunteered to head the facility. Jonathan was going, as he and Rosie would be coordinating the search and destroy efforts against any lingering enemy presences. He had the experience, after all, from doing the same in Sol System. Beatrice would be heading the research and xenology aspect of the facility, digging through what was left of the assemblage. They'd already named their new base Carnage Station. Once they finished the basics, like heat and air, maybe I'd consider poking myself there to check it out. Well, maybe also only after they expanded the electromagnetic cleared zone to cover the whole lobe, so one did not have to worry about having your implants burned out of your head. The new artificial intelligence would also reside on the base, tasked with coordinating the xenoarchaeology efforts, likely to be ongoing for decades. Already, hundreds of humans were signing up to be stationed there to study enemy remains. But before they could go, a lot of work was needed simply to make the place safe. For one, because of the explosion, the lobe was now rotating. This rotation would have to be stopped. And after stopping the rotation, the site of the station had to be on the aft end of the lobe's vector of travel. Otherwise, Carnage Station's docking ports would be vulnerable to impact from incoming debris. Also, a local wormhole facility had to be constructed as the area of study was spreading out by the second. Even the two massive lobes were moving apart at nearly 100,000 kilometers a day, too far for easy travel in shuttle pods. Some of the debris from the former arc's central portion was moving away even faster, although due to its proximity to the original explosion, whether or not anything usable could be recovered from such debris remained to be seen. Another month passed. Alec and Hannah had gone out on Higgins twice more, but it had been over 2 weeks since their last venture. I suspected the lack of any remaining active enemy units had placated their bloodlust somewhat. A few days ago, I met with them both as they wanted my input on some new plan. Dad, I want to lead the offensive against the assemblage colony on Leighton Star. I was quiet as I considered his statement. I had flashbacks to nearly 30 years ago when I had said goodbye to Alec when he'd left on Vexitus. I'd watched as his cyborg shell had been frozen in biosuspension and then launched towards Alpha Centauri. Then my failure a few years after, when I'd had his mind data copy reshelled here on Earth against his wishes. We'd gotten over that mostly, and I knew I'd not make the same mistake again. And maybe this time it would be easier. Via wormhole? I finally replied. Yes, we would first establish a beachhead on Procyon and scan that entire system for any assemblage units which may have already arrived from nearby Leuchten Star. If they had already arrived, we would engage them and drive them from the system. If not, we would build our own colony and defend it with a local version of the Argus Array and the DW line, watching for their arrival. We? I asked, looking toward Hannah. She nodded. I want to go with Alec. Procyon will become a human colony as soon as we can protect it from the assemblage, so we might as well get started with both. I assume that once you build the foothold at Procyon, you will then move on and attack Leuchten Star? Yes. Pickett confirmed that the assemblage colonized that fourth planet there. We will deal with their colony and anything they've built in that solar system. After that, we'll see. I raised my eyes. I'd not been closely following the conscientia groups that were planning such adventures. I'd known they had been calling their plan the Great Cleansing. It began to sink in what exactly that meant. I had flashbacks of our early wars for which the term had been stated as goals. He'd caught my expression, understanding the thoughts going through my mind. No, not eradication. Our hope is to force them to accept containment in the short term, with possible integration in the longer. I just nodded. Hannah's lips were pursed. I wondered if she was remembering the same thing I now was. Mainly, the horrible situation natives in our old country had once lived under back in old Earth when they'd been contained on reservations, cleansed, or contained. Both had too many evil connotations. Are you sure you really want to put yourself through that again? I asked my son. Well, for me, this would be the first time I get to utilize what I trained for, he replied. I'm not the version that is still on its way to Alpha Centauri, Father. I just nodded. What he was asking for, what he craved, was fulfillment. From his point of view, I'd stolen that from this version of him which I'd awakened 3 decades ago. And now, with our unexpectedly fast victory over the assemblage arc, his moment of glory had again been denied. Of course, he would want to go do what he felt he was meant to do. And I had to admit, someone needed to step up and see this through. Did I want to become the warlord for humanity? Hell no, not if I had the choice. First Procyon and Leuchten Star, then on to the next colony, repeating from world to world, back to wherever the damn assemblage originated from. Maybe we'd run into allies as we passed the Hemru homeworld. Maybe they were already waging interstellar war with assemblage colonies much nearer their home, and would ease our burden. How soon? I asked. Sovnia is due to come online in a week, he replied with a grin. What better way to test its ability to accurately target wormholes at extreme range than by sending scouts to Procyon? What better way indeed? Sovnia had been built on Luna as a backup to Sarissa. We'd not only met that goal, but had surpassed it. By utilizing the latest state-of-the-art in wormhole technology, we'd boosted its capacity to 12 light-years, just far enough to reach Procyon. And, he continued, with the upgrades to Phobos scheduled to be complete in a month, we'll be able to follow up Sovnia's smaller scouts with sizable hardware and supplies. We will possess a decent lay of the land regarding any enemy forces, and will be able to deploy our asteroid mining units and prefab manufactories where they will remain safe. Within a half-year's time, we'll have the first habitats built and a decent start on a military-industrial complex. I looked at Hannah. And you're willing to go off and be a warrior queen? It might be some time before it's safe enough to establish any colony you'd want to have babies in. Yes, I am, she said, full of pride. She also looked at Alec with the same pride, not quite love, but a very deep friendship. I knew with what Hannah had lived through, this road would not be too tough for her. And besides, it's not like the old days when we had to endure a year-long sea voyage to start a new colony, she added. With the wormholes, we can come back for R&R occasionally. AIs? I asked. Praxia and Minervus, of course, Alec replied. Well, copies of them. We'll have to come up with new names, I guess. The new AIs are already active and have chosen the names Ares and Athena for themselves. Naomi supplied via my implant. I take it you and the other AIs are on board with this plan to backtrack our way up the AAV, cleansing as we go? I asked the AI subvocally. It is the only logical option. If this does not happen, the assemblage colonies will eventually discover what has happened to the Ark and coordinate a retribution effort, if only to preemptively defend themselves from what Alec has just explained. So we have to attack them before they attack us, because we might attack them. That sounds very paradoxical. I'd said the last out loud, causing Alec and Hannah to look at me with puzzled expressions. Never mind, odd thoughts. I am proud of you, Alec, for once again stepping up and standing post like this. If you need my assistance, even if just to push something through the public discourse, which is sure to be long and frustrating, just ask. My son was going off to war. Again. And maybe not just once, as it looked like our plans to backtrack the assemblage colonies had become policy. If we had to use wormholes, it would take generations. But we did have the ability, even with current technology, to see this through. I'm also proud of you, Hannah, for going with Alec, even though you have seen how ugly conflict can become. I wish you both success. Another 2 months passed, and summer arrived. I was currently on Earth after having snuck back from Mars for a short vacation in the open air and sunshine. Instead of my old island, Riho and I were living aboard Querencia. Naomi had parked the big submarine in the deep waters just offshore the Perhentian Islands, 2 little tropical paradise gems located just east of Malaysia. The reasons for my having snuck back and for living on the reclusive submarine were one and the same. The full details of what I'd ordered done on Vesta regarding acid rain had finally been released to the public. How was that going? Well, let's just say that I was as glad as hell that the gambit had worked. Still, because Naomi was insisting on our seclusion during the ongoing controversy, we had a spectacular private beach all to ourselves. On our 3rd day on the island, and now feeling fully relaxed, exciting news arrived. I was lying on the beach with Riho after snorkeling in the lagoon when I received a call from an old friend in Uxie Esperanza. Hi, honey, are you back in your right mind yet? I quipped. You are too funny, John, Ux replied, deadpan. We chatted back and forth for a few minutes, discussing the public tribulations and outrage I was currently undergoing. We exchanged the latest news from our son and daughter, only to find out that she'd been in contact with both more recently than I had. That she'd talked with Alec surprised me, as our son had finally left for Procyon just a week ago. Apparently, the fact that they had found the system clear of the assemblage so far meant that he still had time to call his mother. I'd have to call him, I guess. I was happy to hear that Uxas sounded happy and normal. She was also as bright and witty as ever. Her brain transplant must have fully succeeded, and I felt my latent worries fade. So, getting around to why I am calling, Ix said, looking serious again, but with a slightly mischievous look. I think I've done it again. You've cracked FTL? I asked. We think so, she replied excitedly. She then went on to explain that she and Rami, along with a small team of technicians and the AI's Gymnasium and Neo-Truffles, of course, had successfully achieved faster-than-light travel, albeit in a very small-scale laboratory setting. They were now working on refining their theory and scaling up the hardware to usable size. She began to explain her breakthrough, and after her 3rd attempt at simplifying the science down to my level, I thought I had some grasp of it. Basically, it was a combination of our existing wormhole tech, along with a new traveling field extender. Or, as it had been simplified, they'd built a wormhole wave rider. A wormhole was formed externally in the traditional way, although very short range, so it took less power. The wave rider then latched on to the wormhole somehow, carrying its starting point with it as it moved forward and extending the terminus always in front of the device. Basically, the rider traveled in a continually moving short wormhole. Even better, Ux had discovered that once operating, the wave rider was not in the same spatial environment as the active wormhole, but instead was in some nearby subspace fabric connected to it. This meant that as the traveling wormhole effect traveled through space faster than light, any matter or energy the frontal aperture came into contact with was instantly ejected out the trailing end without greatly affecting the wormhole at all. Thus, there were no concerns about impacting interstellar debris or particles while the waverider field was active. Hell, she claimed the thing could bore through a star and not even notice except for a slight increase in the energy expended to keep the effect moving. We would need to test that theory very thoroughly before I wanted to be a passenger for that ride. They still had a lot of basic stuff to figure out before they tried star boring, though. Also, other important stuff like how big could the waverider be made, how fast could it go, and how much energy did it consume. Unfortunately, all three factors affected each other, and this meant that a great deal of experimentation would be needed. Then once the hardware and physics were worked out, we'd need to certify this for travel by living or thinking beings. But it was fast. The early estimates were that her new tech would go a light year in 4 days, or roughly 100 times faster than the speed of light. Riho began asking questions and the discussion got too technical, so I just let them talk. But I was impressed. We developed star travel. Riho became excited because, at 4 days to a light year, her homeworld was just a year and a half away. That amount of time was very tolerable, as sailing trips had once taken longer than that. Riho's excitement was dampened somewhat by Ux's timeline estimation of 1 to 2 decades of research and development was likely still needed before we could start building our starship. That night, Riho and I lay in a large hammock under the stars and talked. Our discussion was about what it would be like to travel to her homeworld. She asked if I'd come with her, if it were possible, and I'd said of course. Our conversation waned after that, as Riho became too emotional and needed comforting. A second notable event happened just 2 days later. We were enjoying an early beachside supper when Naomi contacted me. "Jon and Riho, if I may interrupt your supper, there is news involving the Hemru. Please log into virtual to attend a briefing now being hosted by Minervus." Riho had logged herself in before I'd even set my napkin down. I found my implant was already set with the virtual address, so I followed her in. I arrived next to her in a standard virtual meeting room. Avatars of the AI Advisory Council were present, along with some of the directors. Directors Karn Conlon and Williams were not present, thankfully. I also spotted a few of my recent companions, Jonathan, Sux, Beatrice, and the like, and waved. Minervus did not wait and immediately began its briefing. "As you know, we have recently begun deploying distant early warning, or DUWO, automated sentinels along the current vector leading back towards the Hemru homeworld. So far, we have 40 sentinels placed, with each being located an average of 80 astronomical units from one another." A holographic display formed over the meeting table, which showed the linear arrangement of sentinel stations extending well past the edges of the solar system. I'd been following the wormhole deployment of the DEW line sentinel probes. These were big radar platforms, and they were being placed out there to warn us of any oncoming planet killers or reconnaissance probes, Hemru or otherwise. The 40 we deployed so far extended about a 20th of a light year out from the sun. We were hoping to extend the DW line coverage much further, up to a full quarter light year, and also widen the coverage over time. As a point of comparison with the current deployment, it took about 10 hours for light or EM emissions to travel from one sentinel to the next. 3 hours ago, Sentinel number 36 detected a small but fast-moving object approaching the solar system. The object's speed and course are consistent with that of the recent Hemru probe, which passed through the solar system 5 years ago. Signals were sent using Hemru codes derived from that first probe. Shortly after, the signals would have been received by the unknown object, and before interceptor missiles could be launched using Sarissa, the object exploded. While Minervus spoke, all this was being displayed on the holographic display. The directors began speaking with one another. I turned to Riho. "One of yours?" "I cannot say with certainty, Jon," she replied, "but the course and speed would make it likely." "But why would it explode if it received a Hemru code with our transmission?" I asked. "Possibly it was simply a transmission vector." Before I could ask Riho what she meant, Minervus spoke. "Well reasoned, Ambassador Riho. That is also the determination reached by the AI Advisory Council. We'd been talking quietly, as were other groups of humans, but the AI had been monitoring us all. It is reasonable to conclude that, Because of its diminutive size, the object was neither a weapon nor a full probe. Instead, it was simply a tripwire signaling device. When the object received the Hemru-coded transmission, it signaled back to the Hemru world as such. The explosion was likely the impetus energy to form a directed energy pulse capable of reaching the Hemru homeworld or other Hemru assets much closer. The speculation and discussions continued for another quarter hour without any better alternatives being put forward. At least the speed and location of the object pointed away from it being of assemblage origin. Riho's guess that the explosion was a signaling device also stood. The briefing concluded with the plan being to keep deploying the Sentinels and watching for future, similar objects, or worse, Hemru planet killers. The great news was that the new Sentinel DW line system had worked. The object had destroyed itself before we could test the secondary phase of the network, deploying interceptor warheads. But those methods had already been proven. In the future, if the Hemru planet killer had been sent, we now had a working system to deal with it. Riho and I returned to physicality and to the dessert course of our evening meal being served. Omu had prepared an earthy version of Martian foam, sugared goat's cream, flash frozen with CO2 in a vacuum dewar. I could not tell the difference and even had a second helping. Afterward, lying in a hammock as the evening tide came in, we again talked of her homeworld. Someone was getting homesick, and I'd have to look for signs of worsening melancholy. Fall arrived, and it looked like I was going to survive the scandal brought on by acid rain. After finishing the month of July on our island of solitude, and also occasionally watching the debates ongoing in the Conscientia political forums, I finally decided I'd had enough and called for a global public forum to offer my side of the story. During the forum, which I was happy to report had been attended by over 90% of living humanity, I'd given my combination mea culpa, grim reality, and fuck-off speech. As expected, I did not change too many opinions, but the most aggrieved factions had a chance to get in their pound of flesh to me directly. So with that boil lanced, public chatter began to die down over the following weeks, and it looked like the Abrams regime would continue to grind on. Today I was in deep virtual inside the Simulated Reality Project. Why? Well, I was having a visit with an old friend, namely myself from 168 years ago. I was meeting with Jon Secundus, my copy who'd been launched out of the solar system in our first interstellar colonizer ship Evadere, currently in transit to the star system Tau Ceti. How had he gotten here from a starship over 7 light-years away? Well, wormholes, of course. Now that we had 3 working ultra-long-range wormholes, we'd had enough capacity to begin performing functions of lesser importance. One of them being the finding and visiting of the 3 interstellar ships which had been launched since I'd taken back the Earth all those years ago. Happily enough, all 3 had survived and were still on their missions. Evadere was not likely to finish successfully, though, as it had consumed too many resources a few years back when it had blasted back to Earth its detection data of the Hemru attack on the assemblage arc. Our wormholes had found the ship, still limping along and having just begun its long deceleration burn. We had sent through a probe that had rendezvoused with the starship and updated its controlling minimal awareness artificial intelligence. During the link-up, we copied the mind data record of my version, Jon Secundus, and also his logs from while he had been briefly awake when Evadere had sent its dooming messages. Now that contact with the starship had been made, the plan was to begin sending energy and materials back to allow it to complete its mission. Though it was likely we'd already have a thriving colony on Tau Ceti if Evadere ever arrived. The resupply effort was minor and would leave humanity with backup options in case of some unforeseen calamity at Sol. Being only mind data, Jon Secundus was recreated in the SRP in a virtual body looking just like the one he had possessed back when the mind data record had been created before the launch. He had already been brought up to speed on why he was here in the SRP instead of waking up at Tau Ceti. "I hear you've rendered my existence meaningless," was his pissed-off sounding greeting to me when I had arrived. "Sucks to be you, doesn't it?" I shot back, not letting his tone affect me. My guess that he had just been messing with me was proven correct when he suddenly grinned. "At least you nailed those bastards. Well done." We began to chat. To him it was as if he We had just gone to sleep. So mostly our talk was about what I'd been up to for the past 170 years. When I'd gotten to the part about the Vexatus, currently on its way to Alpha Centauri with our son Alec, and then further explained how I'd betrayed Alec's wishes by having his memories made active again here on Earth despite his wishes, John Secundus simply whistled and shook his head sadly. "It sounds like you screwed the pooch there, John," he'd commented. I loved how we were no longer we when it was I who had screwed the pooch. "You'd have done the same damn thing," I shot back. "And yes, I admit it was a pooch screwing, but I've been trying to make amends ever since. That's why you're here inside the SRP. I want to give you the choice about what to do with yourself to avoid another potential pooch screwing." "What do you mean?" he asked, confused. "Well, I need to know what you want," I explained. "We can put you back on the replenished Averill and let you continue on to Tau Ceti. Or, knowing that mission has likely been made obsolete, we can download you into a new shell here and let you live on as John Secundus." "How would you deal with having another you being around?" he asked. I explained about Jonathan, who our coexistence was in many ways like what he and I would have. I admitted that it was weird, but that I'd learned to deal with it. And unlike the still youthful John Secundus, John Prime had lived a lot longer and been through a lot more in the last century and 3/4. There would be clear differences between each of us. He asked to be given time to think about it. I told him he could continue existing here in the SRP as long as he liked. He could even remain here for good if that's what he wanted. The iteration we'd installed him into was the same as the one we'd placed the Amorfati children in, and he might enjoy it. I left him after reminding him a second time to take all the time he needed to decide. Oh, and after informing him about the global ceremony tomorrow. The next day was another global public virtual meeting in Conscientia. This time it was a celebration and award ceremony. John Secundus was to be awarded the new Medal of Honor for his bravery and likely self-sacrifice in ordering the EMA on the Averill to burn irreplaceable consumables in sending back the news of the Hemru attack on the enemy ark. Even though this version of John Secundus had no memories of his actions, the logs and a recording of his awakened time still existed. The entire forum watched a recreation of his active time on the distant vessel. We heard his words as he talked to the EMA computer and watched his pitiful brief existence in the emergency dwarf shell. I was in tears as the recreation concluded, especially when at the end he left his last log entry. "Fuck it, you only live once, right?" I realized that even though it had been John Secundus, I also had said this. He and I had both been wrong. Apparently, we would live many times more. When our wormhole found and visited Vexatus, I stayed out of it. Alec on Procyon was left with the decision of whether to retrieve his cyborg self on board that starship. I was not surprised when he elected to let the biosuspended version of himself remain in biosuspension. He would deal with himself when and if Vexatus later arrived at Alpha Centauri. Something similar later happened with the crew of the Sovrana. A few of the still-living earthly humans who had sent copies off to become crew on that starship elected to have those copies returned and installed into the SRP. The others wanted their copies to remain as they were. I did ask Naomi about the attender I'd met at Abby's memorial in Nicaragua and learned that the Null had wanted its copy to remain as crew. I also thought long and hard about the recordings of Abby's mind data which were aboard Evadare and Sovrana. When she had invited me to attend her death, she had allowed that the copies could be made and only sent with the starships. On top of that, only if either mission encountered hardships which she had experience with could the data files again be brought to life. Now here I had the change to access these mind data recordings. Did I dare retrieve one of them and return it to Earth for safe storage? I admit I was tempted, very tempted. But in the end, I thought back to the time of her death. It would destroy her if I brought her back to life here on Earth. It would destroy me too, I realized with sudden clarity. With those realizations, I left the two copies alone. So Verana itself was thoroughly inspected via remotes after damage had been spotted almost immediately. Extensive repairs were made to one damaged anti-proton engine. If this had not occurred, it would likely have exploded soon after the initiation of the deceleration phase of the ship's journey. Now fixed and replenished, Sovrana was left to continue its long journey, although I was certain all 3 starships would be visited by wormhole periodically. After the situation with John Secundus and the other starship crews had been dealt with, and with the long, warm summer somehow growing dull, I felt a craving for cool fall weather. I returned to my acreage in old North America to enjoy the cool, dry weather I'd loved in my youth. Riho had resumed traveling for her physical global lectures and was gone for many days at a time. I enjoyed this solitary time, going for daily hikes to the lake to enjoy the fall colors blazing on the trees along the shoreline. Adele arrived during this time and spoiled my solitude. She joined me on the hikes and we discussed my impressions of recent events. I found I enjoyed the discourse, her questions helping me settle my mind and providing much-needed clarity. She was doing background for another chapter in the story of John, as she jokingly referred to it. From our talks, I realized how much I had changed in just the past 4 years. Ever since I had come in from the cold of Mongolia and China, what a journey both my life and my personality had gone through. I was comfortable with myself and happy with my new companions. Even more unexpected, instead of being bored by the centuries of living, I was even more excited about the possibilities of the future. We had severely curtailed the threat posed by the approaching assemblage. Humanity could set aside some of the desperation we'd been living in to explore other, hopefully richer avenues of enlightenment. And with the scope even vaster than ever imagined, we could hopefully continue to grow without stagnation. Humanity's prospects looked promising indeed. Epilogue: Ziston Wormhole Facility. Luna. Year 3129, 12 years later. Omu and I flew through the active portal on our wart at nearly 20 kilometers per hour. Short for Wormhole Autonomous Rapid Transfer, the wart vehicle resembled a short utility pole with fore and aft thrusters, handlebars, and foot pegs. The wart had room for up to 4 if it telescoped to its maximum length. But for this trip, only the android and I were aboard, each of us clinging tightly to the central shaft of the slender vehicle, like the tree huggers of old. We were returning from visiting Serenity and Cassius's new fledgling colony on a planet of Sigma Draconis, mankind's most distant world, yet to be settled. At 18.8 light-years distance, of all of humanity's wormhole facilities, only the most advanced Ziston wormhole facility could stab that far. And at that extreme range, Ziston could only transmit smaller, very narrow cargoes or vehicles, such as the wart we were currently riding. Still, my great-granddaughter had not been detoured away from living on such an isolated and distant world. Probes had found that Siggy had a very Earth-like, albeit watery world, and upon seeing the virtually unlimited islands surrounded by pristine beaches, the idea for an off-planet version of Heels in the Sand had been born. Of course, they hadn't named it Twin Heels, despite my teasing. The world was named Aqualia, and the colony beachhead, Serenity's resort island, being that in the most literal sense was called Arcadia. No simple tourist was permitted access as of yet. Instead, she hosted researchers and explorers, along with all the support personnel needed on a new frontier world with limited support. It was a rugged and dangerous place, and only the most adventuresome and courageous traveler could partake of its beauty. The life forms on Aqualia were similar to Earth life, but with enough differences to be unsettling. The areas away from Arcadia's security cordon were also dangerous, and mysteries abounded. I loved the place. It was a perfect counter to the potential stagnation which might result on the fully mastered utopian Earth. Well, mastered other than the long war of retribution we were now embarking on against the assemblage colony worlds. But despite my adoration for Aqualia and Arcadia, I had other obligations to keep, and it had been time to come home. Having apparently survived the trip's final hazard, the rapid transit through Ziston, our wart quickly and noisily decelerated using its compressed cold gas thrusters. We came to a stop a dozen meters short of the hemispherical wormhole chamber's outer wall, the wart now hovering easily in the much lighter lunar gravity. "I hate these rapid transfers," I muttered. "It saves power," was Omu's simplified reply. The android then proceeded to dress me down. "Man up or close your eyes like you always do." The wart slowly rotated in place, bringing its nose around to face toward the Ziston mechanism. The wormhole toroid looked to be shutting down, though. Do we have to wait for Ziston to recharge? I asked. Travel to and from Arcadia was very energy-intensive, and even the Luna grid was pressed to keep up with Ziston's needs. No, Destiny's wormhole will bring us in, Omu replied. Portal formation will commence as soon as we are in full vacuum. I felt my skin suit growing firmer as the air pressure rapidly dropped. My hood seals inflated and my faceplate display began showing breathing air remaining. The noise from the firing gas thrusters keeping us in the hover faded as the nitrogen pressurizing the chamber was pumped clear. The Ziston chamber had been pressurized to match the thicker 112 kPa atmospheric pressure of Aqualia. Now it was being opened to the vacuum of space to clear us of any airborne spores or contaminants we may have brought back with us. Everything grew dead quiet, but I could still feel the vibration of the wart's thrusters through my hand grips. Once we were in hard vacuum, a new wormhole portal tore open space directly in front of us. I clenched my already stressed stomach from proximity to the sudden spatial distortion. The new portal was twice the diameter of Ziston's, meaning I could remain sitting up and not have to cling tightly to the wart's narrow body. A short blast of compressed gas had us moving toward this new portal. I braced myself but kept my eyes open. Damn it! As we passed through the portal. There was the sudden feeling of nothings everywhere, and we were instantly in Destiny's more intimate wormhole sphere. I turned my head and saw the still active portal we just crossed through behind us, now surrounded by Destiny's more compact, state-of-the-art wormhole generator. It was so amazingly small, only a meter or so larger than the portal it had created in its center. It was also not physically tied down by a bulky rotating gantry. No, this miracle of wizardry was freely floating in the center of the spheroid, held in place by AI-controlled magnetic shackles and rotators. Its exotic matter and energy were being supplied by even smaller and more compact local shunting wormholes. We'd come a long way in 12 years. Oh, moo, I subvocalized. Since we are already in a vacuum, does the wart have enough propellant remaining to take us out and do a lookabout around the ship? Omu did not bother to respond. Instead, a circular hatch slid open ahead of us, revealing beyond the star-filled blackness of space. As the hatch opened almost completely, the curve of Vesta just came into view. The wart blew another long blast, and we shot out the hatch. About 100 meters out, we blew to a stop, and the wart flipped end for end. My spectacular view of space in Vesta disappeared as Destiny, in all its awesome splendor, rotated into view before us. Much larger than the first 4 faster-than-light test ships which had been built before it, my flagship needed the extra size because of its mission. We were taking her out to meet the Hemru, and at 256 light-years for the round trip, she needed her size to support the long sea legs required. Do you wish a complete circuit? Omu asked in my implant. It will need to be done rapidly as you only have 6 minutes of remaining air reserves. No, just take us up to the bow cargo airlock, I replied. We could disembark there and the wart could get itself back to the wormhole spheroid on its own later. Omu responded by thrusting the wart sideways. This left us facing the starship as we drifted along its length. As always, I grew emotional when contemplating what humanity had achieved so rapidly. Destiny was both familiar and alien, a mixture of organic, like a blue whale or some other deep-sea leviathan, and the symmetrical aspect of something artificial, a mechanical rigidity and complexity, almost like a gas refinery or ocean-going cargo vessel. Over 400 meters long and with multiple segments up to 30 meters in diameter, Destiny was composed of blended oblate spheroids, narrower at the bow and stern and with larger diameters near the middle. If an earthworm had multiple bands, Destiny might have resembled a fat, bloated version, bulging at each ring as if overfed and ready to pop. Still, I loved how it looked. The stern and bow formations were the wormhole grappling caterpillars. The coils initialized and then pulled the spatial rift around and over the middle segments of the ship, never allowing its physical structure to penetrate the wormhole and keeping it safe and separate from normal space. And by being kept isolated, Destiny was able to ride the edge of subspace, cheating standard physics while doing so. Here and there along the almost streamlined, conjoined, bulging spheroids were complex-looking protuberances, airlock hatches, antennas, energy emitters, missile and probe launchers, and even low-tech thrusters nozzles for fine movements such as docking and station keeping. The larger centrally located spheroids were the ship's fuel and oxygen tanks, some full of fusion fuel and others containing surplus exotic matter needed for any gross spatial velocity adjustments. One of the segments, a true sphere, was the near-space transport wormhole chamber that had just brought us here and from which we just exited. With its 5 AU range, Destiny's near-space transport wormhole would be used for excursions down to any planetary surface, saving us the mass and volume of storing a lander large enough to have return-to-orbit capability. I still almost giggled as I thought of how closely we were mimicking the functions shown in the old television show Star Trek, with our wormhole being our transporter. Another perfect spheroid was our carrier deck. Destiny carried nearly 20 space-capable, autonomous fighter craft, even more space-worthy mobile repair units, and a few human shuttlecraft, even one of the aforementioned bulky landing craft with return capability, simply for redundancy. I could not resist naming our shuttlecraft Galileo and increase the ties to the fictional starship of old. We approached Destiny's forward crew and armament sections. Now in front of us was a large, wide, bulging ring. The ring's outer diameter almost matched those of the large fuel spheroids now behind us. Inside this ring were the ship's partial gravity living spaces. There was only one deck with simulated gravity in the ring, but it was 20 meters wide and with a floor diameter of 28 meters. This gave us over 1,800 square meters of living space and almost 3 times that in volume. The perceived G-force was only 60% of Earth's gravity, or the minimum to keep a shell healthy and strong, as long as one followed a regular exercise schedule. The hab ring was where the active human passengers would spend the bulk of their time. Destiny carried about a dozen such active humans. It also carried over 100 humans in various states of simulated existence, stored as mind data or physical biosuspension. Aside from one, copies of all of Sol Systems' directors were aboard as mind data recordings. Some of them chose to remain aware and active inside our local version of simulated reality. The rest chose to simply be stored as data in the ship's extensive databanks. They would only be brought aware into the simulated reality if some binding treaty needed signing or humanity was forced to surrender to some higher power. Other options for them included being downloaded into newly grown shells, which would take a decade minimum, or for them to borrow one of 3 mature generic shells currently in biosuspension. We passed the habitat ring, and our destination revealed itself in the form of an opening large cargo airlock hatch, complete with perimeter warning lights flashing. The Wart's thrusters fired briefly, bringing our forward momentum to a halt just as we became aligned with the open hatch. A short burst from a rear jet started us moving inward to the Destiny. As we closed the distance, a sensor cluster came into view, having rotated around the curving hull of the ship on its circular mounting rails. There were 2 of the prominent rails forward of the cargo spheroid, one for sensors and the other for side-facing weaponry. No matter the current orientation of Destiny, the ring mounts could bring our side guns or scanners to bear. We passed through the hatch ring and into the voluminous cargo airlock. Our forward jets puffed, briefly slowing us and allowing a mechanical grappler to snatch the floating Wart. Behind us, the airlock hatch sealed shut, and I almost instantly felt air pressure rising outside my skin suit. My implants kicked in to mute the roar as the noise grew to tolerable limits. Inside, the inner lock opened, and I found Riho waiting for us. I launched myself into her waiting arms. Her catch turned into a long hug, which I returned in kind. She then guided me to a handhold and greeted Omu with a nod. "How did you know we would be coming in this way?" I asked. "Please," she replied, sounding slightly off-put. "How long have I known you? I guess that you would want one final look at your baby before we depart. You have me figured out. How were Serenity and Cassius? And how was Aqualia?" she asked after we pulled ourselves through the cargo wreckage, leaving the airlock behind. "Serenity and Cassius are doing great," I replied. "They seem to be having fun despite how busy they are and how much work needs to be done. Aqualia is..." Amazing and scary. Some of the sea behemoths they've spotted are over 100 meters long, and they've only begun to look. Was Serenity pregnant? Riho asked. Yes, I exclaimed. How did you know? Something about her message to you asking you to come, she replied knowingly. It's a women's intuition thing. I just looked at my alien download friend skeptically. If she had intuited Serenity's condition, then she was really becoming human, or she hadn't, and had just made a very human joke. Either was impressive, and it would be interesting to see how she acted back among her own kind. My gut feelings were that all would not go as smoothly as Riho hoped. John, Riho, Naomi spoke into our implants. Please make your way to the main bridge. We will begin our expedition when you arrive. The clock was ticking, so I pulled myself faster. Omu passed us by as Riho and I stopped at the suite locker so I could shed my skin suit. As I undressed, Riho asked me more questions about my trip. The baby? Riho prompted, deflecting me from describing more xenobiology wonders. A boy, I replied, suddenly filled with clear pride. John Benjamin. They transferred him into a uterine replicator while I was there. I even got to hold his transfer sac. That was wise, she commented. Running a new colony world while gravid would be a burden on Serenity and a worry for Cassius. We made our way out of the forward cargo spheroid and into the command and control bunker. With the ship's clock reading just past 19 o'clock, the night watch was on duty at the 3 bridge stations. I greeted my old friends, Tomas Oppenheim, Adis Zabel, and Adele Sol-Chilean. Thomas was overseeing the actions of the AI autopilot. Z was monitoring the drive systems. Adele was handling communications. That meant that she was overseeing the imaging bots she'd stashed around the ship, recording anything and everything, as well as fielding calls from hundreds of last-minute well-wishers. I saw her speaking, so she must have chosen a few to personally reply to while we were still in micro-hole comm range. Seated in gravity cradles in a ring arrangement behind the 3 crew members were my fellow passengers, Angelina Pelbaraza, Jess Kyrvestad, and director Semris Pathwalker. I greeted each of them in turn as I pulled myself into my empty cradle near the center of the chamber. I then assisted Riho into her cradle next to mine. Our cradles were placed between the bridge stations and the passenger ring, as befitted our status of Commodore and Ambassador. Angelina was not an official crew member, but was still paid staff. She'd been hired to see to the entertainment and intimate needs of the ship's crew and passengers during the long journey to come. Jess was along for the ride, but was also here to help with the non-intimate mental needs of the crew. Nobody could predict how humans would handle traveling hundreds of light years away from their home, not to mention being surrounded by billions of giant bug aliens. Jess's therapy skills might be needed. Director Pathwalker was our sole active representative of government. Of all the directors currently on board, only he would be physically awake and active during the flight. This was both to save resources and also to save my sanity. 2 of the day watch crew was foregoing sleep and were lining the bridge also, wanting to watch our momentous departure. One of these was my old educational assistant, Terezjo Purohit, who had volunteered to serve with me again. The other was also an old friend. Megan Hauserman, the lunar weapons technician who had worked with Beatrice and who had assisted with the aftermath of my Forbin caper, had also volunteered. She claimed that her munitions research work had grown boring and that she wanted excitement. I did not inquire too deeply into the city limits of that crazy town. The 3rd member of the day crew was absent, which was fine, as I had not gotten to know him all that well. I shook my head as I realized I had forgotten his name. Jarl something. Beatrice had recommended him, but he was very reclusive thus far. As for the artificial intelligence contingent on board Destiny, there was Omu, who despite her independence had agreed to stand watches while on board. Our pilot AI, Ahab, a verified San Ahab, was a partial presence derived from Stellux AI and was multitasking the job of piloting all the smaller craft on board, as well as the starship. And of course, the ship's overall captain was Naomi. Naomi was going with us because it allowed for her continued existence as an unconstrained AI. Unlike all the other earthly AIs, excluding Omu, she was free to self-replicate and self-determine. Her only barrier to multiplying herself across the galaxy was her hard-coded dependency on me. She needed to constantly know that I remained viable and whole. If we had left her on Earth because of her core hard coding, she would have been automatically reformatted to have similar control algorithms as all other AIs. As it was, by merging herself with the Destiny, she was able to continue functioning as she had. The ship got a powerful AI as captain, and I was able to have my AI companions remain with me. The AI Advisory Council remaining on Earth was assuming her old responsibilities and had taken over her old data centers. She was now confined to the ship, was the ship for all practical purposes, until we physically rebuilt her processor banks somewhere else. The long voyage would be a good test, both for how the AI Advisory Council handled things without Naomi's presence and for the human directors. With my physical removal from the solar system, they were now in full control. We would see how they acted. Of course, I left a fail-safe in the form of Uxie. My ex-wife retained a secret veto power should the directors choose to act stupidly. "Destiny is ready to depart, Commodore. Our course is set and clear," Naomi said audibly over the bridge speakers. "All right, take us to the rendezvous with Jonathan. All ahead full." Again, I barely concealed giggling. The other humans hadn't caught it, but both Riho and Omu shook their heads. I ignored the irony. Everyone was silent as we focused our attention on the main holodisplay. Readings and graphs were being displayed, but all I saw was the row of green lights that said all was well. The main engine coil began to warp space around us. A very noticeable thrum vibrated the cradle I was confined in, and I felt myself becoming nauseous as we dropped just slightly below normal space. The communications displays showing incoming and outgoing data streams all dropped to zero as we severed our links to where we had just been. We were already moving well above light speed. "Now at full speed, Commodore Abrams!" Ahab's gravelly, metallic voice rang out. All the humans began applauding, and all were looking at me. I gestured back, pointing at each of them in turn, and began applauding myself. I surely didn't deserve any credit for this myself. The uneasy feeling gradually diminished as my body adjusted to the new normal spatial conditions it now existed in. I still felt funny, but previous test flights, some lasting weeks, had revealed no physical long-term effects. I'd gone FTL twice before on the smaller test ships, but nothing lasting over an hour either time. Still, I'd survived. All systems are operating nominally. Destiny is now at full speed. We will arrive at the rendezvous point in 107 minutes, Naomi reported. Less than 2 hours to go a bit over 7 light years. Wow, this ship was over twice as fast as the previous testing vessels I'd been on before. "I'm going to go take a shower and get changed into ship's gear," I said to Riho. "I'll join you. Gravity helps me adjust to this," she said, moving her hands, gesturing wildly. We left the night watch in the command center, departing with the day crew, who should be heading to their bunks. Angelina and Jess had remained behind, staring at the holodisplay charting our rapid flight as we passed the orbits of the outer planets. This was the first time going FTL for them both. I suspected he would still be here when we returned just before arrival at the rendezvous. Now clean and dressed, after our delayed shower, Riho and I were back in the control center, in time to watch Destiny return to normal space. This time, the nausea was less, but that could have been due to knowing we were returning to normal. "Jonathan's beacon detected," Naomi reported seconds later. We'd arrived at a spot in space where the remains of the enemy Ark and the still-occupied Carnage Station facility had just passed by. As they had been traveling at 7% of light speed, we hadn't attempted to match their velocity as it would have consumed too much of our exotic matter fuel. Instead, they had used their wormhole mechanism to eject Jonathan and Rosie in a tin can, leaving him behind and having decelerated them to nearly space-normal speed in the process. His signal indicated that he was only 2 million kilometers away, just about as planned. Destiny used its own wormhole to bring him aboard. If we had failed to arrive, he would have been rescued from Earth, as they had been watching over him, occasionally via Sarissa. They would have pulled him home before he ran out of air by using Phobos or one of the other newer wormhole facilities with similar range capability. Jonathan's wart is now aboard Destiny, altering course for the Hemru home system, Naomi reported. All systems remain nominal. Let's get this mission officially started then, Naomi. Resuming full speed, now. I once again dealt with the effects of dropping back into FTL. Destiny is now at full speed, Ahab reported. She is running fast and true. We were on our way. Barring any stops to look around, we would arrive at the Hemru homeworld in about 20 days. Omu and I left the bridge to greet Jonathan. We made our way back through the center of the habitat ring into the transport tube access point. My implant showed him steadily making his way forward from the wormhole sphere amidships. Moments later, the tube hatch opened and Angelina exited with Jonathan and Rosie following. "Look who I found back at the wormhole chamber," she said cheerily. She had her arm around my almost brother, and he looked to be enjoying the attention. She was also kidding about running into him as I had arranged for her to greet Jonathan after his arrival. "Nice ship, big," he said, looking around with wide eyes. I stepped forward and gave him a bro hug, then shook his hand. I noticed he was much less muscular than the last time I'd seen him. He'd not been keeping up on his Knoll G exercises. I'd have to put Angie on the job of getting him bulked up. "We'll give you a full tour later," I replied. "We'll have plenty of time." "Yeah, my fault for bumming a ride back to Earth while you were on your outgoing leg." "Oh well, I guess you're stuck with me for the duration." He was just kidding around as we'd planned for him to accompany us. 40 days round trip, not counting the time we spent at the Hemru world, I replied. "How long do you figure that taking?" he asked. "We're stocked with 2 years of consumables." "Ugh," he muttered. 2 years in a bug house." I knew he was only kidding. He was looking forward to the adventure ahead of us, just like I was. Besides, Destiny was a fine place for R&R. Our full high-dynamic simulation ability meant that one could party by the beach in virtual and never know the difference. "Angie, do you mind if you go on ahead? I'd like to speak with Jonathan alone for a moment." "Rosie and I will go with you, Angelina," Omu said. "Rosie needs an oil bath." Angelina just nodded at the two androids, looking confused. Jonathan and I remembered the line from our childhood favorite movie and chuckled at one another. She just smiled at us and turned to leave, suspecting that because Jonathan and I shared a complicated history, that was the reason for my wanting to talk to him in private. I let her depart with that misconception, as I had something much more serious to discuss with my brother. I motioned him into a nearby open solitude pod. I then closed the hatch, sealing us inside. We were now safe to talk without worry from any passerby. "Were you able to confirm it historically?" I asked, my expression now serious. "Yeah, we've recovered and analyzed enough uncorrupted assemblage archival data to discover that the ARC sensors had detected signs on at least 5 previous occasions. Thankfully, the master AI did not notice or was unable to deduce what it had detected," he replied with an equally serious expression. "And these detections were before we started sending wormholes to the Ark?" "3 of them were," Jonathan replied, nodding. 2 were recorded after our first scouts were deployed, but I have verified that those detections were not of our wormholes." Well, shit. That news just confirmed that a monkey wrench had indeed been tossed into the machinery of our safe little corner of the universe. We just confirmed that we were not as alone as we'd previously suspected. And worse, our as-of-yet unknown neighbors possess similar technology to ours. "It gets better," Jonathan continued. "Our sensors have detected WUOs 3 more times just in the last 6 months. Whoever it is, it continues to occasionally visit the remains of the Ark." "Woos?" I asked, confused. "It's a term I've started using with Rosie. WUO, he said, saying each letter separately. You know, wormholes of unknown origin. Has Carnage Station been transmitting the Hemru recognition codes during that time in Sikadi Hati Securitin? Yep, we included the Hemru IFF in all our transponder codes. Whoever made the DUOs would have heard the Hemru code." "You've relayed that news back to Uxie?" I asked. "Yes, just before I left the station." I thought for a moment. What to do? When Destiny left, neither the DW line nor any of Minervus's other sensors had detected WUOs in our solar system. Did she have any updates? "She said that nothing new had been reported," Jonathan replied. I took that to mean that the unknown wormholes have only been detected around the former Ark. Damn, someone had been using wormholes to follow the enemy Ark. Someone was still keeping an eye on it even though we had destroyed it. Did they know we were responsible? Who was it? I don't know, John, I said worriedly. Maybe we should delay going to the Hemru homeworld and go back. What if something happens to the Earth while we are gone? Jonathan snorted. Your ex-wife must have guessed you'd start to get cold feet. She said that she could handle Earth and that you were supposed to finish your damn mission. At my sour expression, Jonathan laughed hard. Finally, he recovered enough to say, Sucks to be you, Commodore.